In difficult times, it seems the most reasonable thing to watch or fight for what you want. Take care of your well-being in your own way, even if you have to step on that of others. In difficult times, it seems that thinking about yourself is the best thing. Even as believers, you have to push others towards evil. Sometimes, we believers are stumbling blocks for the world. And sometimes we hide behind the fact that these are difficult times and difficult situations where we no longer find God's help and we even see ourselves abandoned. Where is God in our suffering for unjust causes? Does He still have purposes? Is it worth it to continue waiting on Him and walking according to His high demands for holiness? Scripture has a lot to say today. Listening friend, the topic of our message is Joseph and Potiphar's wife. Join us on this journey through the sacred scriptures and let's learn together how to overcome temptation. Before delving into this topic, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell so that YouTube notifies you every time we publish a new video. Let's get started. One of Satan's great exploits in the life of any Christian struggling with sexual temptation is to convince him that the sin of lust is unbeatable. When the Christian believes that lie, he anticipates his own defeat. As one author said, as long as men and women play the role of the victim, as if lust were an omnipotent enemy and they were helpless, they are lost. There is much to be said regarding the battle against sexual temptation. The Bible describes the Christian life as a war. It is a fight of good against evil, the light against the darkness, obedience versus disobedience. The Apostle Paul exhorts us, "Put on the whole armor of God, so that you may be able to stand against the wiles of the devil. For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world, against spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." Listening friend, with the help of God, if it is possible to overcome sexual temptation, in the sacred scriptures we find a character who is like a beacon of hope for all those who struggle with sexual temptation. This character, whose name is Joseph, teaches us that if we walk in fear and obedience to God, we can be victorious against the wiles of the devil. Let's read Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 and 6. So when Joseph was taken to Egypt, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian man, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. But the Lord was with Joseph, and he became a prosperous man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper in his hand. Thus Joseph found favor in his eyes and served him, and he made him steward of his house and gave into his power all that he had. And it came to pass that from the time he gave him charge of his house and all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph, and the blessing of the Lord was over all that he had, both at home and in the field. And he left everything he had in Joseph's hand, and with him he did not worry about anything except the bread he ate. And it was Joseph with a beautiful countenance and beautiful presence. Listening friend, in chapter 39 of Genesis, the narrative returns to focus on the life of Joseph, who is now in Egypt. Joseph arrived in Egypt in the worst conditions, as a slave. But we will see how history will surprisingly turn its face around, and from a slave, he will go on to occupy one of the most privileged positions in Egyptian society. But let's go step by step. Joseph was sold to Egypt as a slave, but surely he kept the hope that his father would rescue him, because he knew that his father loved him very much. Given the circumstances of Joseph's sale into slavery, it is very likely that he believed that he would soon be rescued by his father. But he didn't count on his brothers saying that he was dead. Surely Joseph waited for the day of his liberation, but it never came. What is admirable is that Joseph evidently made the decision not to become bitter, but to make the best of every situation in which he found himself. Now the text tells us, so when Joseph was taken to Egypt, Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian man, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. That attractive 17-year-old young man, displayed in the slave market, was like a prize for whoever acquired him. And Potiphar, captain of the guard, bought it, a prominent, high-ranking military man in the service of the Pharaoh. As soon as Joseph entered Potiphar's house, it was evident that the Lord was with him because God blessed that home with blessings and benefits. And life went so wonderfully well that it seemed like a story about to culminate with a happy ending. But it turns out this was a real-life story. The child of God must face the temptation, worries, and problems of this world, and this was going to happen to Joseph. Let's note that, because of the effectiveness of his service, he was promoted in his position and responsibilities, eventually taking care of the house and all the property. Such was the trust placed in him by Potiphar, who believed in the integrity of this young man, that Joseph did not even have to answer to him. As an officer of Pharaoh, the only thing this officer had to worry about was pleasing his sovereign and performing that task well, leaving all his personal affairs in the hands of Joseph. When Potiphar sat down at his table, the food was already prepared before him. This was the only concern of Potiphar, who trusted Joseph in everything and for everything. However, when things were going well for Jose, they unexpectedly got complicated. Let's continue reading verses 7 and 10. It came to pass after this that his master's wife looked upon Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." And he did not want to, and said to his master's wife, "Behold, my lord does not care with me about what is in the house, and has put everything he has into my hand. There is no one greater than me in this house, and he has reserved nothing for me except for you, because you are his wife. How then would I do this great evil and sin against God?" She spoke to Joseph every day, and he did not listen to her to lie down next to her, to be with her. Egypt not only went down in history for its magnificent pyramids, but also for its beauty secrets. They not only saw perfumes, makeup, and cosmetics as beauty accessories, but as objects with magical and religious properties. Historians say that ancient Egyptian women were conceited and knew very well how to use their sensuality to get what they wanted. And here in the text we are studying, we see that Potiphar's wife was undeniably flirtatious with Joseph. Potiphar had entrusted Joseph with the running of his entire household. He was in charge of all the details. However, while Joseph was thus busy, Potiphar's wife, like him, was also busy with other very different things. She was a shrewd woman, and Joseph was an attractive young man. It is possible that Potiphar was already an old man, because it was common in those times for an older man with good financial means to be married to a woman much younger than him. She had especially noticed Jose and tried to seduce him. This is a strong and daring temptation for Joseph. He reminds us that when we face strong temptations, others have gone through the same thing. Listening friend, Satan wants you to think that your temptation is terribly unique, that no one you know can understand what you are going through. But this is not the case. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 verse 13 says, "No temptation has overtaken you except what is common to man." Now let us notice that Joseph considered everything he was doing as a service to God. He had been taken to Egypt, a country immersed in idolatry, as much as Babylon. In that land dominated by idolatry, Joseph was maintaining himself with a life of high moral standards, a testimony for the living and true God. His response to that woman was eloquent and shows us the high concept he had of marriage, telling her, "Behold, my master does not worry with me about what is at home, and has put everything he has in my hand. There is no one greater than me in this house, and he has reserved nothing for me except for you, because you are his wife. How then would I do this great evil and sin against God?" Listening friend Joseph, he called the thing what it was: sin. He refers to the sin that was before him as this great evil and as sin against God. We want to call sin by another name. Hostility and temper are self-expression. Pride is self-esteem. Gluttony is the good life. Greed is trying to get ahead. Perversion is an alternative lifestyle. Adultery is a cry for help in a bad marriage. Joseph remembered that this was sinning against God. This was probably a pretty safe proposition. There was little chance of getting caught. Joseph, more than being caught, was concerned that everything was before the eyes of God. Joseph had a true relationship with God that cared more than being caught by human eyes. Charles Spurgeon said, "When I considered God a tyrant, I thought it was a little to sin. But when I knew he was my father, I later regretted it. When I thought God was difficult, it was easy for me to sin. But when I knew that God was so good, so full of compassion, I hit myself in the chest to think that I had rebelled against him who loved me so much and only sought my good." Jose refused. Sometimes it just comes down to that. We have to refuse and say no to sin, even when we feel like saying yes. We must realize that life is more than the desires of the body. We are more than our sexual urges, and we should live as more. Personally, and I think we admire Joseph as an example of a man of God who resisted temptation. There are many in the Bible who did not always successfully resist temptation, such as Samson, David, Solomon, etc. Let's continue reading verses 11 and 12. One day he entered the house to do his work, and there was no one from the house there. And she took hold of him by his clothes, saying, "Sleep with me." Then he left her clothes in her hands and fled from her and came out from her. What started as an indecent proposal turned into harassment. Potiphar's wife knew that Joseph was avoiding her, so she made a plan to catch him. Without a doubt, it was she who made it so that no one from the house was there. But we see that Joseph resisted this moment of tremendous temptation. He fled and went out. Jose did what we all should do when faced with this type of situation. The Bible makes it clear in 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 22. He also flees from youthful passions. If we are not running towards sin, we have a tendency to at least stay in its presence, but we are commanded to do the only sure thing: flee from the lusts of the flesh and run as fast as we can. Let's continue reading verses 13 and 19. When she saw that he had left her clothes in her hands and had fled outside, she called those of the house and spoke to them, saying, "Look, he has brought us a Hebrew to make fun of us. He came to me to sleep with me, and I cried loudly, and seeing that I raised my voice and shouted, he left his clothes next to me and fled and went out." And she put Joseph's clothes next to her until her lord came to her house. Then she spoke the same words to him, saying, "The Hebrew servant whom you brought to us came to me to dishonor me, and when I raised my voice and shouted, he left his clothes next to me and fled outside." And it came to pass, when Joseph's master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, saying, "This is how your servant has treated me," his anger was kindled. Let us note the words of the wife of Potiphar, the Hebrew servant. In a time when punishment was brutal and life did not have much value, especially the life of a slave. Potiphar's wife knew that her accusation could mean a death sentence for Joseph. This is why she didn't say his name. She didn't want to think of him as a real person. So here we have this young teenager, alone in Egypt, entangled and framed in the most vile way by this woman, who accused him before the men of the house with the story she had invented, and keeping as supposed evidence the clothes that she had taken from Jose until her husband arrived and was able to tell him her version. Potiphar apparently believed his story and was initially angry. As an officer in Pharaoh's army and a member of the high command, he must have been a very tough and insightful man who must have known what kind of woman he had. And perhaps he thought that the most convenient solution was to put Jose in jail and forget about the whole matter. She would probably have been unfaithful to him on many other occasions, and Jose had simply been one more in her series of conquests. Only with Jose she was not successful, and that's why she falsely blamed him. On the other hand, it must have offended and saddened Joseph to be accused of such a scandalous and outrageous lie. However, he did not seem to defend himself against this false accusation, just as Jesus remained silent before his accusers. Let's continue reading verses 20 and 23. And he took Joseph's master and put him in prison, where the king's prisoners were, and he was there in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph, and extended his mercy to him, and gave him favor in the eyes of the prisoner. And the head of the prison handed over to Joseph the care of all the prisoners who were in that prison. Everything that was done there, he did. The head of the prison did not need to attend to any of the things that were in Joseph's care, because the Lord was with Joseph, and what he did, the Lord prospered. This wasn't fair. Sometimes there is a price that must be paid for resisting temptation. We do this in faith, trusting that God causes all things to work together for good in those who love him and are called according to his purpose. From what we have read, it might seem to us that Joseph was a truly unfortunate young man. Making a brief review of his life, we will say that in his home, he had been the favorite son of his father, distinguished with that tunic of many colors. But that privileged condition lasted until his brothers, consumed by envy, tore off his tunic and threw him into a well. There, he could hear them haggling over the price with some merchants, until they agreed and sold him as a slave destined for Egypt. He was only 17 years old, and I believe that until that moment, and after arriving in that country, he must have spent many nights crying with nostalgia for his family. Now, he had just been elevated to a new position, a high position, as he was a very capable and attractive young man. And then Potiphar's wife appeared and tried to seduce him. His high ethical standards and his sensitivity to God prevented him from giving in. The result was the false accusation of that woman and her imprisonment. Let us remember that although Joseph had been promoted to such high responsibility in Potiphar's house, he was still a slave. Obviously, the woman's word was accepted without discussion, and before he could defend himself, he was declared guilty. And soon he found himself in the prison where Pharaoh's prisoners were held. If God blessed Joseph at the well, if he blessed Joseph the slave, we should not be surprised to see Joseph's blessing in prison. None of these terrible circumstances derailed God's plan for Joseph's life. As happened before in Potiphar's house, Joseph rose to the top, becoming the main administrator of the prison. Through his experience in both places, God developed the administrative skills that Joseph would one day need to save his family and save the entire world. Spurgeon said, "The Lord was with Joseph when he was cast into prison. He knew that God was with him in prison, and so he did not sit sullenly in his pain, but hastened to make the best of his afflicted condition." Listening friend, let's be honest. Joseph in prison and in Egypt was upright. Whether free or slave, he was upright. On the other hand, in our time, sexual relations seem to be the simple consent of two people. But for Joseph, this consent had to come from the Lord. Integrity never depends on the circumstances, no matter how difficult they may be in your life. And on the other hand, the Lord acts in the silence of time, and even through extremely difficult situations. The Lord will continue to work according to his purposes, as the believer must maintain his hope in him. Perhaps many are wondering, where was the Lord in this difficult and unfair situation for Joseph? Why does God allow us to go through so much suffering? Of course, we are talking about the suffering that comes from keeping the law of the Lord, or from living a righteous life. There is another suffering that comes from sin. Sometimes we confuse this and feel abandoned in the suffering of our own sin. Joseph was suffering for his faithfulness, integrity, and holiness. There is a prosperity gospel that tells you that God only wants your success and for everything to go well for you. This is extremely false. God does want you to be well. And there is no greater good than being made in the image of Christ, and the Lord will allow, according to his mercy, love, justice, and sovereignty, that things have to happen in your life, even if they are difficult while you are transformed. Until we all come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to a perfect man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. Let us remember what the Apostle Peter said, which you rejoice, although now for a little time, if necessary, you must be afflicted in various trials, so that when your faith is tested, much more precious than gold, which, although perishable, is tested by fire, may be found in praise, glory, and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. And so we come to the end of this video. We hope that this information is a great blessing for your life. Thank you very much for being part of our channel. God bless you. And with me, it will be until a next video.